Welcome to the Little Bit of Life podcast. I'm your host, Tabitha, better known as Little. You may think you know me from social media, but Little is shown off the apps. That's until now. This podcast is dedicated to having those real, raw, and occasional chats together about what we seem to think but don't say. Special guests will join me that have impacted me along the way. Nothing is off limits. Sit back, take time for yourself, you've earned it, and enjoy today's topic. One voice, one story at a time. Let's dive in together. Little Bit of Life podcast is brought to you by Hello Love Nails. I have been using press-on nails for 15 years. And yes, intermittently, I have been doing acrylic and gel and dip and powder and everything in between. I struggled to find press-on nails that actually stayed on. I have been using them for over 15 years. I have tried every style, every option, thin, thick, every single shape, and yes, every single glue. There's nothing worse than having to travel with a tiny little travel glue inside of your purse because you never know when they're going to come off. Say hello to a game changer. Hello Love Nails. Say goodbye to messy glues and frustrating applications. With Hello Love, you'll enjoy hassle-free, long-lasting nails that look and feel amazing. Get ready to slay any look effortlessly. I am in love with them. This is the nail game that is strong. I can use one set of nails for over 2 to 3 weeks. And if I want to change it up for a fun night out, a concert, or I just want a little bit of sass and spunk in my summer, guess what? I simply just go pull a new pack out, order online, and it arrives right to my very front door. A change that I can save time and save money. Head on over today to www.helloloveinc.com/little. Hey, everybody. Welcome in A Little Bit of Life podcast right here with your host, Little. I am so excited to have on our guest today. When we talk about female empowerment, we talk about really surviving and taking our power back. She is the epitome of that. Welcome on. I have on Danielle with me today. How are you? It's good to see you.
Hi, I am so good and I'm so happy to be here. I'm honored. So thank you. It's a good day.
I really want to just start off by diving right in, especially because when we did our intro and we talked about you coming on the podcast, you have completely taken back your power. I think as a victim, that is so important for us to really get that story out there and to state that you are not stuck in that sense of survival mode, but you can get through it and take your power back. So take us back to what happened to you in 2018.
Yes. So November 18th of 2018, I was living in St. Charles, Minnesota, a very small town in Minnesota, with my 3-year-old son, and my ex-husband had moved out. We separated, and I woke up in the middle of the night and had a gun pointed at my head. I was zip tied and raped 3 times over the course of 5 hours. And I had to appease this man with a mask on. I didn't even know who it was. And I had to appease him and stay quiet while I was being raped and tormented and mentally traumatized so my son wouldn't wake up and become part of the situation. After about 5 hours, the man did leave. My son and I got out. After about 3.5 months of an investigation, he was captured and he was sentenced to prison, almost 21 years. And in Minnesota, he'll serve about 14 years.
When we think about being in the comfort of our 4 walls and being at home, and especially with you being a mom, the last thing that you expect is to have somebody standing over you and for a situation like that to happen. What was your mindset in that moment? Because hear this so many times with victims. You have an adrenaline rush. It's that fight or flight survival. And you're having to think about your son that was obviously in the home with you.
Yeah, at first it was disbelief. So, am I dreaming? Is this real? Is this a joke? And then it became survival mode. So, I disassociated. I looked at the situation and I made mental notes of what he was wearing, what he looked like, things like that. And then with having my son, my 3-year-old son in the house, literally just survival mode. Something in me like transitioned to a lioness, and the lioness will always protect her cub. And that's what I did. I did what I needed to do to protect my son. We did make it out alive. Never think about yourself being in those situations because it's what on TV. That doesn't happen in small town Minnesota. But then it did, and we got out of it, and I'm just so thankful that we had a great law enforcement team to work with, a great prosecutor to work with, and then, of course, the rapist video recorded himself raping me. So there was also a lot of evidence in the case too, which I know is something that not all survivors have. And so I'm an anomaly, and I hate that. I hate that I'm an anomaly. And I did get justice. I got to see him go to prison. I got to hear him admit, I did this to her. I raped her. I'm guilty. And a lot of women don't get that. And I hope that changes someday. I hope that it's not looked at as he said versus she said, but I made it out alive. And I think life is so much more beautiful now. And colors are brighter, and everything is just, I feel more alive now than I did beforehand.
For a lot of victims, I think the fear is always the reporting aspect. They always
Mhm.
wonder, how do I report? Where do I go? What do I say? How was that reporting process as a victim for maybe someone who may have gone through something even closely similar, or they may just be deciding, especially now, maybe even after time has passed, they're nervous, they're afraid of being that victim, they're embarrassed. What was that reporting process like for you?
That's a good question. And I think if anyone is hesitant about reporting, the best thing that you can do is talk to a victim advocate, and they will give you all the information that you need to make that choice for yourself. You don't have to report. You don't have to report so he doesn't rape anyone else. That's a form of victim blaming yourself. But I would say talk to a professional, talk to a victim advocate, and they'll help you make that decision. For me, I ended up telling my mom what happened. My son and I went to a grocery store and met my mom there, and my mom called 911. So my choice to report was taken away from me, but I'm thankful that it was because my mom made the right choice in reporting him. I think that's probably the best advice I have to give is just talk to a professional. Otherwise, there's a ton of resources online that can help you talk through the steps. Otherwise, the national hotline you can call to.
Being in that moment and having probably a million different things cross through your brain at the same time, but yet you're so still in that moment, and I'm sure it's almost like you're in pause. How did you learn to make your mind process the key small details to remember? Is it from TV? Because, like you said, we would never imagine that this would ever happen to us. So, how did that intuition click in that moment?
It's I have no idea because the man, I didn't know who it was. He was disguising his voice. He threatened for 5 hours. I know where you live. I know how to get into your house. I have a gun. I will go to your son's school and I will kill your son if you tell anyone. So he threatened me for 5 hours to not tell anyone. I had no plans to. I had no plans to report at all. But for some reason, I still needed to make a mental note of what color his skin was, what colored his beard hair was, what his hands felt like. I think my idea was I need to tell somebody. And then so my plan was to just tell my mom. And then my mom and I were going to work through a plan to keep me safe. But honestly, I had no plans to report. I didn't think about what they do in the movies. It was just an instinct maybe. And maybe it was an instinct stemming from all these stories that I hear on podcasts and on movies, but it was just something that I didn't think about. It was like second nature.
So, you were very brave and courageous in that moment. I think that a lot of listeners may be sitting there going, I have no idea what I would do in that moment. Which brings me to the question, this individual, your perpetrator, did not know you at all. So, going through the court proceedings and him stating guilty, did you ever get that information and kind of that closure of how he found you, or that obviously that reason with victims is always the why? Why did this happen to me?
Yeah. So actually, come to find out, he did know me. He lived about 4 hours away in Minnesota. And I had known him for about 10 years at the time. He was a groomsman in my wedding. And one of the things he said when he was in my bedroom was, I've been waiting for years to be in this position. So it's like he had been planning, he knew what he was going to do. And even his friends and family have said things like, I always knew he was capable of doing something bad. I just didn't know what. And now we know what that bad thing is. So when law enforcement was going through evidence, they found a tote full of things, electronics that he had stolen. And in there, they found a notebook. The notebook had my name, my address, and I had never given him my address. So that's how he found me. He probably just Googled, where does Danielle live? Because I Googled myself and my address was right there in Google. Under my name was another gal's name from South Dakota and her address. So it was like he got me and then he was going to maybe go after her, but then he was caught by law enforcement. It took about 3.5 months, but what happened was he was accused of sexually assaulting a male vulnerable adult in Wilmer, Minnesota. And that man did report his sexual assault to authorities. He got a rape kit, and that rape kit matched with my rape kit. So now we have two rape kits that match with one same man. And that's how they found out that it was Zane Peterson.
Wow. 3 months. When you say
Hmm.
that out loud, it seems quick, but when you're living day to day, how is we always talk about mental health here on this podcast. How is your mental health? Not only because this occurred in your own home, but you're still having to be a mom and do all of the normal life day-to-day things, but you know that someone is out there and you're just waiting for them to be found.
Exactly. And I didn't know if it was somebody I worked with. I didn't know if it was a neighbor. I left my house that day and never went back, essentially. And some coworkers of mine put me in what we call a safe house. And I had a confidential address. I had all these steps to keep me safe. But I was a zombie. I was in autopilot. I was being a nurse at the hospital that I work at. I was being the charge nurse of 55 nurses in autopilot because inside I was dying. But I still had to be a mom and I still had to do it all. So I did. And I think something about being a woman and being a mom just gives you the strength to get through it. And a lot of the coping mechanisms that I had. So people would say, don't read social media, don't watch the news, go to therapy, do this, do that, do this. But my body was saying other things are going to help you, like writing. So I wrote, I bought a motorcycle, that helped. I kept my mattress and I lit it on fire and I torched it, that helped. So my ways of getting through it aren't weren't the traditional ways of getting through it, and I just had to listen to myself, I think, through that time.
I love hearing that because I feel that so many victims almost feel a sense of embarrassment and shame. But then you're getting all of this information thrown at you at one time. Go to therapy, talk to this.
Mhm.
How's your mental health? Do this. And I love that just because something works for someone does not mean it is a structural linear line that works for all victims. I think that's very important. I know a lot of victims have come on and shared their story, and they said, I felt like even worse of a failure for reporting because I couldn't even get myself to go through therapy in an effective way. It wasn't helping me, it wasn't changing me. And how amazing and empowering because you just found your own way of things that helped you heal through the challenges while still feeling what you needed to feel in that moment.
Yep, exactly. So,
Wow. It brings me to the question because you said you were writing. You are now an author. You wrote a
but
memoir. It is amazing. I'm putting the link in the bio.
what
If anybody has not read it, please. How long did it take you to write your book, 4 Pounds of Pressure?
pretty much a few days after I was raped, up until the day he was sentenced, is pretty much how long it took me. I had no plans of writing a memoir at first. I would journal. Because when I would tell my friends and family what happened to me, it got redundant and it got hard to talk about. So I wrote it down and I just said, just read it, read what happened because I don't want to talk about it anymore. So every time something happened, I would journal, whether it was a court hearing or when I had a falling out with my parents or when his DNA came back and they arrested him. I wrote about it. And then when he was sentenced, I put all my journal entries together, and that's how I came up with my memoir. So it took me 2.5 years, but that was simply from living it and experiencing it. Since then, I've written a sequel memoir called Another 4 Pounds of Pressure. I have two children's books, a novella, and then I'm working on my sixth book right now. I interviewed 12 sexual assault survivors from the Midwest, and I've put all their stories or all their experiences in a book, and that should be coming out in the fall.
That's amazing. Good for you. I think so many people always question, well, if this happened and you go through therapy or you heal, why do you continue to bring it up? And I always tell listeners, especially on this podcast, this is a form of reopening a wound when a victim explains their story, only because it takes you back to that moment. But I think that we are in this generation now, and we're in this era that victims are speaking up not out of embarrassment or shame or guilt, but truly feeling empowered because we're connecting with others in the society around us that we never even imagined with social media and books and things like that. Do you feel that writing for you, the book, and then getting it together in that 2.5 years was like your form of therapy, but almost like healing and closing that wound after that last chapter?
100%, because now the experience is in my hands. The ball's in my court. I get to talk about it. I get to tell the experience. And feedback from listeners is so empowering too. It's rewarding, it's healing talking about it. So I think that after people are sexually assaulted, sometimes they want to pretend it didn't happen. And if that's what they truly want to do, that's fine. I wanted to go on top of the Empire State Building with a megaphone and scream about what happened to me because I wanted to make change. I want to talk about it because it's not shameful for me to be sexually assaulted. It's shameful for him to sexually assault. And getting down to the root cause of sexual assault is the perpetrator. It's the bad guy. It's the rapist. That is why rape happens. And I know that. I lived that. It wasn't my fault that he could get in a basement window. All these, all the reasons that people victim blame are just complete crap because it's not the victim's fault. It's shameful for a rapist to be a rapist. So talking about it helps to normalize women and victims talking about it. And so that's what I like to empower other people to do is to talk about it because it normalizes it. Makes you feel not alone, makes you feel not crazy. And hopefully we can shed light on some of the bad guys that are out there.
I agree. Even in the last, I would say 3 to 5 years, if you said the word rape, it was this immediate defensive, negative
Yeah.
type of reaction. If you said sexual assault, just those two words, so many people would almost be, if it didn't happen to me, it's hands off. I can't talk about it. I don't want to focus on it. I feel in the last 3 to 5 years, we've really come leaps and bounds. We have a lot more direction that we could improve on, but it's because of people such as yourself. You're showing there is a silver lining. You're showing you have the ability to move ahead. You don't have to stay stuck there. A lot of victims have come on and stated they almost tried to steal myself. They stole my identity. They stole who I was, and I was never going to be that person again.
Yeah.
Which brings me to ask that question. How is it now that this happened to you in 2018, which really isn't that long ago? And you seem to be in a great space. How has this changed your life in regards to how you live, how you interact with people, especially because I would always be on guard of who's at my house, what's going on. I would almost be in that panic. Do you still feel that, or are you starting to learn and heal with that too?
I'll never have a welcome mat at my house. No, I like to give the glow stick analogy. So if you're a glow stick and you're in your package, you're just hanging out there, chilling there, but you're fine. You take a glow stick out. How do you make it glow? You have to break it. You have to break it and you have to shake it up a little bit. And that's how a glow stick glows. And I think that resonates with me because before I was raped, I had been sexually harassed in the workplace and I was living content. I was happy with my son. I was healthy, working out, but I was content. And then I was broken and I hit rock bottom and I had so much rage. Honestly, I had so much rage that I felt like I understand why people are criminals because I am so angry. I could be a criminal. I could do something bad. But then I started to heal and I did go to a support group. I got my motorcycle. I started running again and I started taking the steps I needed to feel better and heal myself. And now I feel, like I said before, everything is just more beautiful and all these opportunities are out there waiting for me to grab when before I was content. And I think some people find this, whether it's surviving sexual assault, whether it's surviving cancer or an illness, you can find that epiphany almost, this epiphany feeling. And I think that's what, obviously makes you grow stronger. But it was that moment in time that honestly changed who I was. If I could go back and undo what happened, I wouldn't. I would just take my son out of the situation because I appreciate who I am now compared to who I was before.
In the beginning, you stated he was sentenced. He did admit his guilt, was found guilty, and in the state of Minnesota, he would serve around 14 years.
Yep.
Looking at that calendar, is that something that you have a fear when that 14 years comes? Obviously, is there additional protection? Because I think a lot of victims will listen to this and think, okay, if I report, or maybe they're in that situation of obviously maybe the case that they were found guilty wasn't a life in prison type sentencing. They're going to get out. Now what happens to me? And they almost live in fear. Do you feel that as well?
Golly, of course. Yeah, I might be in Europe. I might be in Australia. Who knows? That's where I want to be. But realistically, no. And why don't I live every day in fear? I do, but that's not a way of living. And if I lived that way, that would be giving him all the power back. And I'm not going to do that. Luckily, and I know not all victims have this, and I wish they did. But luckily, with talking about it, I've built an army of people around me that I have all these people around me that support me and love me and care for me, that I feel safe and I feel safe in my community. And to be honest, even some of his family members have reached out and said, "We support you. We're here for you." A distant family member reached out and said he was always mean to his cousins. We're worried about when he gets out because what if he shows up to a family barbecue? What are we going to do? So, yes, I have until 2033, which is the year that my son graduates high school. And that's the year that he looks to either get out on parole or be institutionalized. The countdown for him, but it's a countdown for my son and I too. It almost feels like this is our period of freedom right now because when he is out, who's to say he's not going to break parole and come down and find me? Even now, while he's in prison, who is to say he's not going to hire somebody outside of prison or hire his cellmate who's about to get out to come find me and kill me? That might certainly be the case too, because he's that, I don't want to get myself in trouble, but he's that narcissistic or sociopathic or whatever it is. I have all these fears all the time, but I'm not going to give him the power to control my life anymore. He did that once for 5 hours and then all of the aftermath that I had to deal with. But now the ball's in my court and I'm not going to live that way.
Your son was 3 when this happened. Obviously, it was in 2018. Have you had that hard conversation as a mom with your son of this happened to me, obviously with the age and stuff like that, especially because as he grows older, one, he may possibly read your book, which I think is a beautiful memoir. But two, how do you explain that as a parent to our child?
That's a good question. I'll start by saying that I have been reading him some books that teaches him about consent and body parts that and what red flags are and that you shouldn't keep secrets, things like that. Um, so I'm teaching him how to be a good person. Unfortunately, when I was raped, the rapist let me go in my son's bedroom before he left. And so my son actually heard the man's voice and heard the man talking. He initially thought it was his dad, but because of the circumstances, you can find the details in my memoir. But because of the circumstances, I told my son it was a worker man. But then we left our house that day and we never went back. So my son was like, "Why can't we go home? Why can't we go see our neighbors who he was best friends with?" And so eventually my mom and I said, "Honey, do you remember that worker man that was in our house in the middle of the night?" Well, that was actually not a worker man. He was a bad guy and he wasn't supposed to be there that night. My son was 3 at the time and he didn't really know what questions to ask or how to process that. So we let it go for a while. But since then, he's been asking more questions. One of my recent questions was, "Mommy, do you remember that man that was in our house that night? Does he live there now?" And I was like, "Oh, no, he's actually in prison because he's a bad guy." But my son knows there's a bad man in the house. That's why we don't live there. He has no idea what happened to me. And yes, he might find my book one day, but if he does, the last chapter of my book is a letter that I wrote to my son. So if he reads the book at the very end, we'll have that special connection to each other that can make him feel like he's not reading it alone or that I was thinking about him when I was writing it. But and I have a daughter now, so it's a little bit even more complex. But yeah, so he's doing fine though. My son, I think he may be on autism spectrum, so we're getting him tested for that. But because of that, I think he doesn't maybe really know what questions to ask. He doesn't ask a whole lot about it. He just has some theories and just leaves it at that.
I asked that question because I think it's so important to for parents that may be listening that it's really hard nowadays to have conversations in general, but to have these conversations as early as possible with our children is very important. Like you said, no secrets, having them be comfortable to talk to you and that you are available to listen and to hear. I always say on this podcast, those are two completely different things. I really appreciate you coming on, sharing your story. I really hope that there is even one person that's listening that may have received some form of empowerment from this episode, or maybe you'll just send it or share it out to somebody who maybe needs it. We really embrace victims and victim stories here on this podcast. I am a huge advocate for sexual assault victims being able to have a platform to share their story, to share their struggles. But it's amazing because I'm so honored to have all of you on that have ever come on and shared your story because you're showing that they do not take control of you. They do not
Mhm.
write the narrative, and you just created a new narrative. And I'm so proud to know you, to have you on. I think what you're doing is beautiful. And if you haven't read her memoir, it's in the bio description. There is absolutely no excuse that you are not rushing to order this.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. I just wanted to say too that it's okay to use your experience to propel yourself forward. I heard that in a podcast once and I wanted to mention it, that I'm using what happened to me to propel myself forward in life and to do things for the greater good. So,
I love that. Well, you're doing a great job. And I can't wait for people to share this episode, interact, especially on the YouTube. And yeah, if you're a victim, it is okay to go alongside other victims. We're all standing beside you. We're not in front of you or behind you. We're right beside you. And we're all going through this together and getting our power back.
thank
That's a wrap already on today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for spending your time right here with me. And a very special thank you to today's sponsor. We are stronger together, louder as one, and truly a family connected. Be sure to leave a review to bring others along this journey with us. Tune in weekly on your favorite streaming platform. Or if you're interested in being a guest, send me a message today. Let's get to talking. Until next time, be good to others, be good to you. See you next week.